morning/afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our CMMC 2.0 webinar. My name is Melanie Mann, and I'm Programs Manager here at MXD, and I'll be your host and moderator for today. And now I'm excited to hand things over to Michael Tanji, MXD's Director of Cybersecurity, to get us started. Mike?
Thank you. Good day, everyone. My name is Mike Tanji. I am the Director of Cybersecurity at MXD, Manufacturing times Digital. MXD is a manufacturing innovation institute, of which there are 17 in total. We are one of 8 that are sponsored by the Department of Defense. Our purpose as an institute is to digitize and secure manufacturers that make up the defense industrial base, and to support digitization and security efforts in the organic industrial base. We are also charged with upskilling workers in the manufacturing sector, and our workforce training capabilities provide access to a wide range of learning content that allows workers to acquire the skills necessary to take advantage of the newly digitized environments. In keeping with our mission to support defense manufacturing, we've brought to the table Tara Lemieux, one of our foremost experts in cybersecurity maturity model certification, or CMMC. If you're on this call, you know that CMMC compliance is something that you have to achieve if you're going to continue to do business with the department. And Tara has been involved with CMMC pretty much since the beginning. She literally wrote the book, or at least a book on the topic, is an assessor, and is going to imbue us with her wisdom and insight into the compliance process and its importance to national security. Ladies and gentlemen, Tara Lemieux.
Hello, everyone. Imbue, I like that, Mike. Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to be here today. Just allow me to go ahead and share my slide deck. And for those of you who don't know who I am, you can visit me on LinkedIn. You can ask questions. I love to interact with individuals on LinkedIn, really because it helps keep us grounded. When I first started in 2019 is when we really kicked off our CMMC project. The DoD reached out, and their board of directors reached out to me and said, listen, we really need to engage people who are going to try and make this a thoughtful and meaningful process and take it away from being like all the other ones. Right. And you know, if you've been in the Department of Defense or worked in this industry for long enough, there are a myriad of different assessment standards that will time and time again kind of weave themselves into existence here. So today, what I want to talk to you about is the practicality behind it. I think, you know, after doing, I think I've done almost 40 assessments under the CMMC version 2.0 so far. And before that, lots and lots of work with the DIBCAC, who are the DoD's assessment team. And really some of the observations that I've made along the way, I want to share those with you. And I hope that it's going to make things less chaotic for you, maybe a little more manageable, and hopefully a lot less scary. So I always like to start with, you know, our shared understanding, right? So many people within the defense industrial base are not anti-cybersecurity. They want to do the right things. They want to do the right things because it's going to keep their business safe. If you keep your business safe, that means that there's less opportunity for you to show up in the news headlines as one of these, case studies of a False Claims Act or something of that nature. The part that's fearful for them is really the compliance piece, really knowing how this applies to them, and then taking something like the NIST 800-171 standard and making sense of it, right? And often what we see are people who are trying to fit the standard in their environment. And so a lot of our assessors now are kind of, time out, let's take a breath here. Let's talk about how you do business first. Let's understand what the requirements are for you. Let's make sure we understand what kind of data you're handling. Let's make sure that we think about the protections that are associated with each of those data types. And then talk to me about what you have in place so far. And when you can approach an organization from that vantage point, it doesn't feel so scary, overwhelming, right? And the bonus from that too is that we can start to economize, right? So if you take a new standard and you force fit that architecture over your organization, there are going to be some pieces that maybe fit, some pieces that don't fit so well. And that's where a lot of companies are churning effort and a lot of extra costs because they're not thinking about really the basics before they kind of start in this effort. So with that said, what is the CMMC and what is it not? It's not a paperwork exercise. If you're following along in the news, the Department of Justice's Civil Fraud Initiative has been really making some waves. And what they do is they make sure that they're looking at fraud within the defense industrial base. So, for example, for those who have submitted their SPRS score, which is your self-assessment of your CMMC compliance or your NIST 800-171 compliance, that self-assessment is a formal attestation to the Department of Defense. And so if it is later discovered, either through a whistleblower, key TAM effort, or perhaps through, an oops, there was a breach and that invited the DoD to kind of start looking into our organization. That's when you start seeing those heavy fines leveraged. So for those of you who are not watching those headlines, I think the last settlement was close to $9 million. And of course, the whistleblower who brought that forward received 15% of that $9 million recovery. So it's getting really kind of cutthroat out there. Yeah, but rightfully so, because our warfighters are the ones who are going to be benefiting from this. And our supply chain is going to be more secure as a result of that. So the last thing we want to do is just buy a tool, right? There's lots of fancy tools out there. I love some of the GRC tools or the governance and compliance tools, but buying a tool doesn't automatically make you compliant. You, again, have to understand your requirements. You have to understand the flow of data in your organization, and then take a step back and start thinking about what tools might work for us in this effort. And there's no one tool that's going to solve it all. I know if you're watching on LinkedIn, there's a battle between GCC Hive versus Google Workspace. To say one is better than the other would be kind of a disservice to you. It really depends on what you need for your environment. Also, don't throw this over the wall to the IT department and then take a step back. This is a risk-focused kind of standards and assessment methodology. You have to assess your cybersecurity risk, and that risk in part, or the risk acceptance or tolerance, is in part defined by the Department of Defense. So if you throw it over the wall to IT, that might seem like a great idea because those are the guys with their hands on the levers. But ultimately, that might not serve you well in the long run because they're not necessarily closest to understanding what risks can we potentially accept and which ones do we need to mitigate or remove. And it's not a one-time event. So over the past 10 years, we've seen continuous monitoring roll through the Department of Defense and other agencies. And that stresses the importance of making sure that it's not a one and done. Once you have your self-assessment, you kind of have to start still looking for those risks, right? So anytime there would be some kind of new vulnerability or new issue related to some of the technology that you might be utilizing, you're going to want to know what to do with that information. And the CMMC is kind of built around that because it builds in those annual self-assessments, but also it brings in the expertise every third year or triennially. And that ensures that, you're not getting out of alignment with the DoD's intent behind the implementation of CMMC. So why do organizations burn money? First and foremost is scoping. If you don't get scoping right, if you don't understand how to draw the chalk lines around your protected environment, you're either going to do one of two things. You're going to include things that you don't need to include, right? And so there's extra effort, costs associated with that, and even some risks associated with that. Or you underscope, right? You don't consider different asset categories that are maybe not the primary focus of CMMC, but they're important because they help to reduce our threat exposure. And so from that vantage point, number one, if you haven't read the scoping guides yet, you can go to the DoD or the DOW CIO website and you can pull down the level 1 and the level 2 scoping guides. There is a level 3 scoping guide, but that's something that DIBCAC is really responsible for generating and pulling together. And those are going to be very kind of limited case-based for those types of level 3 assessments. The tools first strategy. There are a lot of well-meaning and intentioned vendors. They want to build something that helps our defense industrial base. And I'm so grateful that they're out there to innovate. But the downside of that is if you don't understand the compliance methodology in total, you could potentially, create an opportunity whereby you bring in this great tool, but it's limiting you in being able to demonstrate your story that is internal to the organization, right? So 90% of what we do on an assessment is making sure that the organization understands how they do things. Not only how they do things, but what is the primary focus in terms of protection, and how do they continually evolve those protections over time? No governance owner, that one's pretty straightforward, I think. In terms of governance, what we're really looking at here is not just someone to own the effort, but we're really talking about here is somebody who can help make those more difficult decisions, or those decisions that are in the best interests of those organizations based on their current maturity, based on their current needs. And then, of course, there are some CMMC in a box policies and templates that you can download after you pay a certain price. I would be very careful with those, right? If you take something that is not yours initially, it becomes difficult to kind of articulate that to an assessor. So start with what you know. I always tell people a great SSP doesn't have to be 75 pages. It just has to give me some insight into the organization. Where are your boundaries? How is information flowing through those protected boundaries? Do you have any external service providers? If there are external service providers, are they accessing protected information? And if so, how are you kind of interacting with that? How are you mitigating those risks associated? How are you implementing each of the security requirements for the NIST 800-171 standard? So with that said, again, my approach has always been, as a consultant and as an assessor, tell me how you do things, right? I want to learn about your organization. I love that there are great assets out there that you can pull in. Those resources are wonderful. But let's start with the basics. If we don't start with the basics, we're going to run into a scenario, the first of which is we have expanding costs that are hard to manage, but we also run into a scenario whereby we could potentially set ourselves up for a False Claims Act violation, right? Or an investigation. And by that, I mean, if you don't understand the confusing implementation instructions in an SSP that you've just purchased, then how are you going to make sure that you are in fact compliant to that standard, that you've configured everything correctly, that you haven't forgotten about the things that are important to your organization? So the cost of overscoping or even underscoping, right? If it's overscoping, we have more assets, we have a lot more evidence that we're kind of generating to demonstrate how those controls are implemented, and then ultimately more audit time. And the standard of care here should be, in terms of scoping, let's make sure we follow the data. There's a great old commercial that I used to love watching. It was the Cheeto commercial. And the father is really angry because somebody is taken away with his Cheetos. So he pulls out a black light and in an effort to kind of see where the trail is. And when he turns on the black light, the Cheeto dust is everywhere. So that's kind of like, unfortunately, CUI is kind of like the glitter of our environment. So we have to be very mindful of that. We have to watch what that looks like because it can get very unruly. And I think part of the history here, at least I can speak for my 40-something years now in DoD, is back in the day, we used to just have one big file folder and everything was stored in it. And that kind of created this longer lasting attitude that people don't understand how to do the restrictions up front. So if you decide the scope, make sure the scope is correct. If you have questions about scoping, right? Is this asset, I have a smart thermostat within our office environment. Is that an asset that we need to be concerned with? So it depends. And those depends conversations are probably the ones you want to get on the phone with someone like me or Mike, really to talk through and understand how does the data interact with those devices in your environment, and how does the DoD view categorization of those devices? So war stories, right? I can tell you when we first started CMMC, the DoD invited us to sit on their assessments and then ultimately lead their assessments. And what we found were, out of all of the SPRS scores that were submitted, a good majority of the individuals who had submitted their SPRS scores, they were absolutely wrong. In fact, we had many occasions whereby an organization thought that they had a perfect 110 score, only to find out through the assessment that they were actually in the negative. You're probably asking, well, how do you get a negative score if there's 110 controls? It's part of the DoD scoring methodology. So they have this perception, we've done everything right, we wrote the policies, we've hired the smart people, we got to be at least 80% compliant. But the reality is that once we conducted those assessments, they weren't looking at the right scope. Not only were they not looking at the right scope, they weren't looking at the correct scope the right way. And that introduced a lot more work on their part to kind of cue things up. So the reality check is usually when I work with an organization, the first thing they'll want to do is, what are my requirements? And they'll take all 110 security controls and they'll think about, how do we implement this in our environment? But beyond that, right, it's not just the 110 security controls or requirements across those 14 control families. We are also looking at the 320 assessment objectives, right? And the way that we score things in CMMC is there's a list of assessment objectives that kind of sit beneath that requirement. So for example, under AC 3.1.1, they're A through the number of assessment objectives, you have to get each and every one of those assessment objectives met for the scope of your environment in order for you to kind of parlay that to a met on that control. So the challenge here is really to not dive in so quickly, right? Again, take a step back, understand what your environment is, and then take manageable chunks of that whereby you can kind of grow and leverage that throughout your organization. The smarter lift here is don't try and do it all at once or boil the ocean, as we like to say. You need to make sure that your boat's secure first, that you understand kind of like the path that you're going to be taking, your navigation, but you also have the right resources and focus for that as well. Number two biggest issue is not understanding what's FCI versus controlled and classified. So federal contract information, it's usually described as information not intended for public release. The FAR clause, FAR 52204-21, that gives you 15 basic safeguarding requirements that you must meet in order to interact with federal contracting information. And the requirement associated with this is every year the DoD expects you to do a self-assessment within the SPRS system. And what did we say earlier about those self-assessments? That is an attestation, a formal attestation to the Department of Defense. And if it's inaccurate, either through willful negligence or oversight, it's not going to matter. Those fines may still be imposed to your organization. So you need to be very careful about that. So controlled unclassified information, it's a little bit more, right? That would be information that would require some additional safeguarding or dissemination controls. No foreign, for example. So there are 110 security requirements that are articulated in NIST 800-171 Rev 2. Those 110 security requirements and the 320 assessment objectives must be met in order for you to obtain your CMMC final level 2 certification. The requirement here is every year you're going to do a self-assessment, but on the third year, you're going to repeat your independent or third-party assessment. And so at our organization, we are a C3PAO. We are already working to schedule those individual companies that have been through their first assessment so that they're on the calendar 3 years from now. And again, there's a lot of demand for the people in our industry right now, and make sure that you're thinking about that, because what we're seeing now in terms of availability of resources, lead assessors particularly, you're going to see that again in another 3 years. That cycle, that cadence is just going to continue to repeat itself. So again, your data flows. I always like to have the organization draw a data flow map, right? First, do a data inventory. Tell me what kind of information you receive into your organization that would kind of rise to the level of being protected. And then talk to me about how it enters your organization, where it lives, how it's being interacted with, and then ultimately, if it leaves, how is it leaving? if you don't understand that first, you're not going to be able to, you're not going to know what to protect, right? And if you don't know what to protect, you're either going to protect everything, and that's going to be way too much money for your organization, or you're going to forget something critical, and you're going to be in a compliance or non-compliance status, which has impacts to your contracts, right, with the Department of Defense. It could invite investigation by the Department of Defense. Again, making sure we understand those data flows. Now, there's lots of resources out there. I have some articles that you can look at that talk about how to develop a data flow diagram. And don't try to do all data types at once. It's going to drive you crazy. Start with workflows, right? So so-and-so in HR receives this contract that may or may not have CUI attached to it. And so therefore it is managed in this way. And walk through each and every one of those kind of workflows for your organization, which is a lot easier because you already know how to, those workflows work in your organization. Once you do that, you can start to visualize what that is going to look like. And so the hard mode is what I described earlier. The hard mode was 20 years ago, we just used to shotgun everything into one big folder directory. And we really didn't care who accessed it or how it was accessed, right? If you had a clearance, then you could access that information, rightfully or wrongfully. But now we're thinking in terms of, let's reduce that, our CUI footprint. So if we can maybe set up a smaller area within our larger network or larger organizational environment, and we can restrict how people are accessing that environment and how devices are being managed that interact with that environment, that makes a much more efficient and effective kind of approach to CMMC implementation. So isolate that CMMC or that CUI, excuse me, to a specific segment within your organization. Sometimes we call it a DMZ. Then you're going to want to kind of let that define your scope. Watch how that data is moving in and out of those areas. And ultimately, that's going to kind of reduce your target area. So let's talk about external service providers. This is another big issue people are running into. So with external service providers, it is so absolutely tempting to hear an organization say, well, we do that and we can do it all for you. But qualify what all means, because ultimately, whether or not you choose to go with an external service provider or do it all in-house, you are ultimately responsible. And if you've read the DFARS rule, the new rule that, kind of defines and dictates that you must be CMMC level 2 certified for this type of data handling, you'll see that the DoD intentionally moved that requirement to ensure that your external service providers are aligned with the DoD requirements. So that means if they're interacting with CUI data, now they have to start talking about, if they're a cloud service, that they're FedRAMP moderate, authorized, or equivalent. And all of those regulatory kind of that body of regulatory information really helps to define how you're going to interact with those external service providers. So make sure you understand, number one, what are you getting in this service agreement? But also we need to start talking about making sure that if you bring in an external service provider, not only are they meeting the FedRAMP moderate, authorized, or equivalent requirements if they handle CUI, but there's a mechanism in place, usually a customer responsibility matrix, that tells us directly what our responsibilities are as the OSC. So if it's an ESP, they're going to do some things, and they're going to ask you to do the rest. So understand that relationship, make sure you have that shared responsibility matrix, and then ultimately make sure that you're understanding really, what the agreement looks like and what it provides. And, thinking about the risks associated with an external service provider. For example, what if a provider that is FedRAMP moderate authorized falls out of compliance? How are you going to manage that within your organization? Oops. So some scoping pitfalls, not understanding how shared services kind of interact. So for example, we had an assessment whereby that organization brought their entire ERP system into scope, when in fact it wasn't, right? So the individuals who were working with that ERP system, they were dealing with kind of like the employment records, time cards, things that wouldn't naturally fall into CUI, right? So again, understanding your data could have prevented bringing that entire department into scope, putting them through the self-assessments, making sure that their data was managed to the same level and so forth. Bringing your own device. So I always caution, I don't like bring your own device. I know I'm going to get some hate mail about that, but it is what it is. And here's why. So the DoD has a memo, and that memo describes what you must do and what happens when you have a BYOD within your environment. And it talks about things like making sure it's not jailbroken. You can make sure you have some security surrounding that. No, by the way, if there's an incident and we need to grab that device, that we have access to that device. And that introduces probably a lot more conversation than what we're initially having at the business level. We want to accommodate our employees. Sure, let them have their phones and, let them have whatever devices make them feel more productive in our environment. But when you do that, you're introducing now more complexity and the opportunity for additional risks to be introduced into your environment. Cloud services, I talked a little bit about this already. So if you're going to store your data in a cloud, it doesn't absolve you of all responsibility. There's security configuration settings that we're going to be looking at during your assessment. So if you're using Microsoft GCC High, all right, show me how individuals are provisioned into that environment. What do you do, Mr. Customer, versus what does your service provider do? And oh, by the way, is it configured correctly, and is it operating as intended? And a lot of people don't understand that's really what we look for as assessors for each of those controls and assessment objectives. Is it implemented correctly? Is it operating as intended? And is it producing the desired outcome? If we can't kind of tell the story, the narrative around that, then it becomes a lot more difficult for you to obtain your level 2 certification. And the hybrid chaos, right? So the chaos between those poorly defined boundaries between your public and your secure zones. We had an assessment whereby it was a machine shop, right? They were building tools and components for a Department of Defense contract. And the shop where they were utilizing those machines, and it was directly aligned next to the loading dock. So trucks could pull in, they could, drop their shipments and then pull out. There was nothing really there to protect. So that now we're starting to talk about, is that an assessment impact, right? So if we don't have those boundaries understood and defined, you're going to run into these kind of fluid conversations that you really don't want to have on your CMMC assessment. So for the strategic decision, if you can segregate your CUI work, the rest of your business can stay at level 1. And what that means is if they have a contract with the Department of Defense, then they'll do their self-assessment annually. If you have it whereby your CUI is in an enclave, right, that becomes much more manageable. Now we can kind of put boundaries, the chalk lines around that, and control what comes in and what comes out. We can control how we're interacting with that environment. And again, we can control how the devices are connecting to that environment. Leverage, don't buy. Before you buy into the Microsoft GCC High or the Google Workspace, you still have to do your own due diligence. Those tools are not easy to manage. There's a lot of configuration that is associated with that. You need to factor that into your implementation strategy. So for example, you'll see a lot of managed service providers or managed security service providers, they'll do the implementation for you and that configuration. And there's quite a few companies out there that specialize in making sure that the implementation is correct within your environment and that you as a customer aren't forgetting anything. If you already have a solution in place, but you don't understand how it's being used, right? You don't have to have a Microsoft GCC High in order to pass your CMMC level 2 certification. There are other ways around that. Ultimately, working with the right team will help you understand, how does what we have in place already help to align with what we are striving to do as an organization. And finally, if you are going to use these tools, make sure that you understand and you take advantage of the inheritance. And so inheritance is a way that the DoD introduced for CMMC that allows you to take credit without having to reevaluate everything that has already been evaluated under FedRAMP moderate authorization. So that's why those services are a little more costly, and they're a little bit more complex. It's because you get the opportunity to use that inheritance and leverage it. And by leverage, I mean, when I do your assessment, I'm not going to ask Microsoft to come to the table and talk to me about their services. I'm going to look at their FedRAMP authorization packet. I'm going to make sure it's current. And I'm going to make sure that that CRM, or that customer responsibility matrix, really defines what your responsibilities are and that you are in fact doing those responsibilities. So again, keep this in mind when you're thinking about the tools. I know they're nice and shiny and you want to come into it with the idea that if we get this tool, it's going to be a lot easier, but you could honestly be creating a lot more work for yourself. So implementing cloud first, the take here is, why build a vault in our on-prem when we can rent a safety deposit box? And so some of these cloud service providers, Google Workspace, Microsoft AWS, they allow you to take advantage of those services that they have available. And again, when you do that approach, right, it takes a heavy lift, a heavy burden off your organization in terms of costs, both the implementation itself, but managing that technology over time, making sure that you have availability of those resources, right? So these organizations already built in their backup for you. So if something goes down or there's an issue with some service, they're already flipping over to another box to help maintain that service for you. Smart hiring, the human element, right? I thank you for qualifying me as an expert coming into this, but I will tell you now, there are no CMMC experts. In order for somebody to be a CMMC expert, they would have to understand and be have a very good understanding of the NIST standards, not just 800-171, 800-53, 800-66, anything that would be used as kind of to inform our implementation. You'd also have to have a strong regulatory background, right? Understanding how those rules are going to come into affect your organization and how they could potentially create an adverse consequence for you. If you're going to bring in a consultant, that's, we love that idea. Interview them. Make sure that they understand your environment, not just that they have the fancy badge and the credentials. We want to make sure that they're going to be able to work for you within your environment without making a big mess of things. And we've had some of our assessments that we've had to delay because the consultant coming in made a mess of things. And so there's a lot to kind of recover in that space. So you can use a consultant early on. It's a lot less expensive. Before you start to engage that C3 PAO, do the same kind of prep work. Make sure you understand what comes with their service package, right? What if we have to reschedule? What if I have to take advantage of a POAM? Those kind of things, you want to make sure you understand the costs associated and whether or not they can accommodate you from a resources and bandwidth perspective before you actually sign that contract. I will say, number one, SSP. If you're going to put effort into anything, make sure that your SSP articulates your plan for implementation of those controls. There is a specific control, CA, Security Assessment, Level 2, 3.12.4, that gives you a list of everything that needs to be in your SSP, internal, external boundaries, right? Making sure that our assets are included and they're properly categorized, and so forth. And oh, by the way, if you're going to take advantage of a POAM or a plan of action and milestone, how does that look within your environment? And make sure that that's reflected in your SSP. So if it's not written down, if it's not formalized, it doesn't exist. I can't assess against it. So when I come to do your assessment, I want to make sure that you have an SSP that has been formalized and that is actually in practice, right? it's being used, it's being updated, and so forth. And that's going to be the kind of the guide stone for your assessment. Again, when is FedRAMP required? I've made this very simple graph. It's very simplifying a very complex kind of workflow. But ultimately, if you bring any service provider in, including people who are cleaning your office, right? They're an external service provider. The people who are doing maintenance within your facility, they're also an external service provider. Are they going to have access to those environments that store, process, or interact with CUI? Are they going to then be required, if they're a cloud service provider, to then, have those additional DoD credentials kind of leveraged on top of that? So FedRAMP moderate, authorized, or equivalent. If not, then how are you going to manage the risk associated with them still? Because, just because they don't have to be FedRAMP moderate authorized, you still have to manage the risk exposure related to those individuals, either coming into your environment, performing worker services, and ultimately having access to, protected information. The equivalency trap. Don't take a vendor's word for it. So if you're going to leverage an external service provider and they say, yes, we are equivalent, right? Make sure that you understand what that means and that you have it documented. So for us, that means that there's 100% controls alignment. So all 320 assessment objectives, 110 controls. There are 0 open POAMs. Nothing that would be related to the security control implementation. They've had a full assessment by a third-party assessment organization, and their SSP and their security AR, they're all kind of they're up to date, and they're providing what they need to in terms of that equivalency. So what happens if you bring somebody in and they say that they're equivalent, but they're really not? The DoD doesn't care, right? That was your requirement to make sure that those individuals and those companies and services meet the standard. So however you want to do that in your organization, you need to start thinking about that. And oh, by the way, under NIST 800-171 Rev 3, we're starting to look at supply chain risk management. So everything that kind of encompasses your supply chain, how are you as an organization managing that risk? So governance model for small teams, right? Usually what we like to see is the person who's going to be able to kind of commit funds and resources, we want their buy-in. We call them an executive sponsor. But that could be someone like Mike, director of cybersecurity, or it could be somebody who is maybe in a lesser role, but has more familiarity with the system. The control owners, right? So each control family, we need to understand who are the responsible authorities associated with those, who are our stakeholders. The practitioners are going to be the one who are going to be generating and collecting evidence. And of course, people like me will validate your implementation either through an internal kind of gap analysis, or we'll have a more comprehensive C3PAO assessment where our assessment team comes in and we make sure that you are in fact meeting the intent of those controls and that you understand how it's implemented within your own environment. So your roadmap to certification, start with, again, that discovery, making sure that you understand really what do we have? What do we have and how do we need to manage that? That's the first step. If you don't understand that basic requirement, then you really shouldn't be leveraging, or you really shouldn't be downloading NIST 800-171 to think about how you're going to implement 110 security controls. Understand the basics first. It really helps to do a gap assessment, right? So once you have done your exploration, your discovery, you're going to do your preliminary data mapping. Then we're going to talk about making sure that you understand the intent of those 110 security controls or 320 assessment objectives. And by the way, if we do a gap assessment, how are we assuring that we all have a consistent view of what those requirements are? It's one thing to have a really smart person in the room tell you what it means. But for you to really take advantage of this governance standard, you need to make sure that everyone has the same kind of language, the same understanding of what these requirements are. Remediation, we call it the longest phase, but really it's the most iterative phase because you're always going to be finding something to fix. And those fixes may not be necessarily an assessment impacting fix. In other words, you've got to make this change, otherwise you're not going to get a met on this control or the security requirement. It could be something that helps to reduce your threat exposure. You're still going to want to kind of build in the cadence for that. And of course, your documentation, all your documentation needs to be in its final form. Your SSP needs to clearly tell your story. If you have any questions about what should be in an SSP, NIST has some great resources, but also going back to look at the requirement within NIST Standard 171 that speaks directly to what your SSP should minimally contain. And then, of course, your C3PAO certification. Again, you're going to want to interview, find the best match for you, make sure you understand all of the different services that are associated with that C3PAO. If something goes wrong, how are they planning for it? How are they going to accommodate you if we have to kind of push things out? And oh, by the way, part of what we did within the CMMC is we've given you 2 opportunities to fix things. So if it's something minor, right? If I'm conducting your assessment and your as documented doesn't match your as implemented in your SSP, I'm going to give you up to 10 days following your closeout brief to fix those, right? At the end of that session, right, when we do our final findings, you'll receive a conditional level 2 certification until you can demonstrate that you've closed out all those gaps. Most organizations are going to close them out before we do the final findings because they want to be done with this. Now, you have another opportunity. If you are, you have a more critical control, right? Something that is potentially not something that we could easily remediate within 10 business days. You'll get 180 days provided it meets the requirements to be considered as a POAM. And you can read the assessment guide and the CMMC assessment process to understand what we look for there. But we'll give you another 180 days to close that out. So again, in that pathway, you're getting your level 2 conditional until such time as you can demonstrate that you have in fact closed out those POAMs. Once you close out the POAMs, we'll issue you your final certification. And we also want to make sure that you're taking ownership of those POAMs as well. Now, finally, in terms of the assessment, right, when you conduct your assessment, be prepared to think about things like our cage codes, right? So the DoD has a system that they use, CMMC EMAS, and that EMAS system is the kind of like the source record for all of the assessments that are taking place in the DIB right now. Now, not everyone can see that. Only persons with elevated status within the DoD, primarily acquisition, and people like a C3PO who are actually entering those records. And if you, for example, change one of your cage codes, right, or you add a new service within your organization, you need to understand the implications there for a reassessment. Now, under the final rule, there are some hintings at what would trigger a reassessment. And in terms of reassessment, what we're looking at is something that would be considered a security impacting change, or it's kind of redrawing the boundaries for your assessment. And as it pertains to cage codes, if you're wanting to bring in a new cage code, that may require you to have another assessment to bring that cage code into scope. That's all I have for today. I hope I didn't overstay my welcome. I think we're doing okay on time. Does anybody have any?
We're doing great.
Okay, perfect.
We do. We've had several questions kind of pop up, so I'm going to kind of run through a few of those, and we will try to get to as many as we can with the time we have remaining.
Perfect.
The first one is a question around cost. Is the cost for CMMC 2.0 for startups in the ballpark of $100K to $150K as mentioned in various online sources?
No, we certainly don't charge that. And those are not just small businesses, right? For larger businesses. And again, be very careful in reading those LinkedIn posts because you want to understand how they're defining or qualifying that. So for example, 150,000, does that include your implementation? Does that include your technology stack? Does that include all of the consultancy associated with that? If so, how does that kind of factor in? Or is that just the cost of the assessment? Now, also, by the way, there are resources available in every state within the United States through the Manufacturing Extension Partnership. And, there are other great resources too that kind of help to broker lower costs for those smaller organizations and to make it more realistic for organizations within our defense industrial base.
Okay, great. Next question. Can you elaborate more on how to keep an ERP system out of the scope of the assessment?
Right. So make sure you understand what it's touching, right? So again, that Cheeto commercial that I love so well because you can kind of visualize it. As soon as a device, a component, a workflow or service touches that CUI or that protected environment, it's potentially being brought into scope. So how could you then, take some efforts to, kind of carve that chunk out of your scope? Well, isolating that service, making sure that the access restrictions are in place so that people who have ERP rights do not necessarily have the CUI rights. And again, all of that comes down to understanding your business and how you really want to operate, right? You're not going to be able to download a book or on CMMC that's going to be able to give you the perfect view of what that looks like for your organization, but you are going to be able to make some meaningful decisions that reduce that scope in terms of isolating, maybe doing some segmentation, maybe introducing physical or logical barriers by and between those different services. But there are a myriad of different ways, and that's just maybe one or two of those.
So you mentioned small teams, but what about startups who may only have 2 to 3 people total and a very limited budget? Where can they find some good resources on starting the process of CMMC?
Right. So the conferences that we have all throughout the year, it's a great opportunity for you to meet the people who are actually out there assessing. So, for example, CUICon we just had in Florida just a few weeks ago. For that, right, we were able to kind of interact with the defense industrial base, the larger of the defense industrial base. In terms of if you have 3 people environment, right, we've done assessments for 3 people environments. And in some of those assessments, their scope was like massive and it didn't need to be, right? So in those environments, one person could be wearing multiple hats or playing different roles within that organization. So we would expect to see kind of things like least privilege and how are you managing the separation of duties, for example. And also getting back to the basics, right? Do you really need a level 2 certification assessment? If you're only handling FCI, right? The requirement there is that you do a self-assessment and that you do that annually. So do you really need the level 2 certification would be the first question I would ask. And I know there's a lot of pressure coming down the pike from the primes. All of the primes are now required to ensure that their supply chain that may be accessing CUI actually has that level 2 certification in place. Now, not to disparage any of our primes because they all do amazing work, but those are kind of like blanket requirements that are going out to everybody that may or may not apply to you. So, if you understand what the requirements are, you're empowered to have those discussions and hopefully be more successful at saying, listen, Prime, we're only handling FCI. And according to the FAR 52204-21 or DFARS 252-204-7012, this is what we are required to demonstrate. Now, of course, the primes can always ask for more than that, and they will. But again, if you wanted to push back, get educated so you have the kind of the tools and the conversations and the, discussion points to have a meaningful argument.
Is it possible to share sanitized drawings or CAD files with non-CUI service providers?
So how do you mean? So they've been redacted? Is that what we're talking about here? I'll presume. That's one use case, right? So if you have redacted CUI, that CUI is still protected information, right? It's still, even though you've taken the steps to redact it, I would have a lot of questions as to who performed those redactions and, was it DoD? Was it, somebody that sits within your organization? And then looking at those CAD drawings themselves, right? Are they actually sharing CUI? So we had an instance whereby a 3D printer was being used to kind of machine a part. And the organization itself was convinced that CUI was being moved and transited 3D printer. But when we looked at it with a little bit more care and kind of discretion and understanding, number one, what is FCI versus CUI, we were able to determine that it really wasn't in scope, right? So those kind of discussions you should be having as an organization now. And if you don't know, reach out to our experts on LinkedIn or our quasi-experts, as I've said earlier. If you have a trusted advisor, reach out to them and say, I think we're doing this okay, but I would just love to get your opinion on this.
Fantastic. We are coming up a little bit on time, and Mike is going to share a few additional resources. So this is going to be our last question. Have you seen small teams balking at CMMC and going paper only?
Oh, that's the big elephant in the room. So if you saw the Department of Army and some of the other agencies put forth some instructions about if you only have paper CUI, this is how you manage it. And it's a much tinier scope. But that means that we absolutely have done our due diligence to assure that there is no CUI coming in. It's not being printed, right? Because once you start to print things locally, then now you have a device that is accessing a protected information system that is sharing CUI. There's a lot of ways to get trapped in that. But there is conversation now, right? So again, I love those conversations because we're really talking about how do we reduce scope for our organization. Great example. I had a guy that was a one-person shop. He was responsible for doing all of the asphalt within the military bases throughout the state of Maryland and Virginia. He was told that he must be level 2 certified, but we sat down and we looked at it and we, ultimately were able to say, these things don't apply to us and here's why. And so the effort there was articulating why these things don't apply.
Well, thank you so much, Tara. Really great presentation. Before we close out, I am going to hand it back over to Mike to share some resources. Mike.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tara. Again, that was fantastic. If you want to learn more about MXD in general and our role in securing the manufacturing sector specifically, you can visit mxdusa.org and navigate to our cybersecurity resource hub. There you will find our CMMC Level 1 playbook and additional resources there. Hopefully this summer, we will have our CMMC Level 2 compliance tool available. If you want to think about TurboTax for compliance support, that's what it's going to be. In the course of your cybersecurity journey, you find that you need to procure some kind of solution. We have a cybersecurity technology buyer's guide and a cybersecurity skills hiring guide. And again, to reiterate, for people who need to acquire new skills, our virtual training center has a number of upskilling and new skills courses available for members to take. We hope you found this webinar helpful, and thank you for attending.
Thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon.